Naturally, in a lot of shift-based companies or organizations like those in food and beverage, healthcare, manufacturing, whatever it might be, scheduling changes are inevitable. My question for you is, how do these changes result in unauthorized overtime hours from employees due to confusion? In this segment, John, Woody, Woodrow, and I will be discussing how to stay on top of these changes through communication to stop unauthorized overtime hours at the end of the day. Let's get right into it. It really feeds me well into this next topic, talking about staying on top of scheduling changes with communication in place. So, looking at this next slide, if I can get it up, here we go. Awesome. So, looking at this next slide, talk about improving your internal communication. I'm curious, because obviously shift-based industries like manufacturing, food and beverage, healthcare, whatever you're talking here, are constantly changing in terms of schedules. As we said, how should HR and ops teams actually ensure that any alterations to their schedules are communicated, and to employees to actually minimize that risk of unauthorized overtime?
Collectively, like HR and ops together should be discussing like what are those parameters, like, hey, all unauthorized overtime needs approval, or are there exceptions, like the example I gave before? A mechanic is in the middle of a machine at their shift changed. Do you want them to go try to track down their manager and might lose 20 minutes to a half an hour trying to track them down, and who's going to approve this? Again, are there situations where and maybe that's more unplanned, that's an unplanned overtime, but at the end of the day, it needs approval. Overtime needs approval, and somebody should sign off on that. So what is the vehicle to how that's going to happen? Do you have technology where that could happen on a phone? Does somebody need to sign up in advance for that overtime? That's the best case scenario. So then when you see somebody out of place, it's like, I didn't see their name on an overtime sign up board sheet, that type of thing. So working together to first determine what are the overtime parameters, if you will, especially when it comes to authorizing and who's going to authorize that overtime.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it making sure that it's getting brought back to the manager at the end of the day, that they're the ones signing off on it. Is there any tools or communication practices, protocols that you've used that have actually found effective in keeping employees informed about changes to their schedules?
I've worked in union and non-union environments,
Mhm.
and while I would always want my employees to speak on their own behalf, so that tells you kind of where I would lie on this. But sometimes, in a union environment, what the benefit is you have a contract, and it's laid out pretty clear. And usually, in most union contracts, there's one of the major points of that contract is overtime. Who gets the overtime? What's the sequence?
Mhm.
Who gets to sign up for it? What are the qualifications? I would implore those companies that are non-union to have some similar guidelines. When there is overtime, who qualifies?
Yeah.
And how do I sign up for that? And so to answer the question, it's what I've seen work is very visual on who is getting authorized for the overtime.
Mm.
So I have overtime today. At the end of the shift, Meredith, you're qualified, you're top seniority. We're asking you first, and we've communicated to everybody. Meredith has got it. So that way, on the back end, Woody's not working because he just felt like it, and nobody knows because it hasn't been communicated.
Yeah.
So upfront communication, very visual on who's working.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it really does feed in with the aspect of educating yourself on, common laws, regulations, talking about exempt versus non-exempt employees, what that looks like for your state. It's really important, right, to stay on top of these kinds of things. I think, for us in terms of a tool, obviously within the technology side of things, We have a client, Green Forest Staffing. They're a staffing agency for cannabis farms, actually. So they partner up with all these farms across Portland, Oregon, actually beyond Portland even. And I think they have, I want to say like 30 farms and growing, something like that, where they have a lot of people in a lot of different places, right? And they have a couple managers who head, teams and people at certain farms. They have relationships with these farm owners and people who are running them. And it's really hard for them to say, all right, I got to pinpoint this person. That by the time they email them to say, hey, make sure that you're clocked in here, or hey, this is the address they need to be at, whatever it is, it's really hard to get a hold of them, once they're already on the site or maybe not on the site. So having those in-app notifications is huge. We have the communication tool here. It's absolutely important that these managers are actually able to en masse talk to their team, or as individuals talk to team members, specifically these frontline workers who are switching out between farms and making sure that, hey, actually you're not at this farm today, you're at this farm. So having that communication tool is absolutely key. It makes sure that there's that top-down approach of communication really seamlessly. Again, by the time that you connect through them with an email, sometimes it's too late. So having those in-app notifications, having the popping up right on your phone screen is absolutely huge. And that's a tool that we've used with many clients on our end of things.
Yeah, to build on something you said there around the relationship and the communication. Again, there's some places where it's like somebody's working remotely. It's a little harder to maybe track them down. But if you're in a site, frontline leaders, this is about communication and personal relationship. So, and also there's in those guidelines and parameters, there's a coaching aspect, I'm sure, at least in my history, where you're trying to understand what happened the first time. Did the person know? Were they knowledgeable, or was this intentional? And you're putting somebody on notice by a coaching. You're trying to correct the behavior, but also in those guidelines have to be some progressive discipline, because unfortunately somebody probably in all of our walks of life are not going to follow those guidelines. And they need to know what the consequences are. Hey, we're giving you 1 or 2 coachings. After that, it's a verbal, it's a written, and we're going down a path, and all of that just needs to be above board. So when you have to go down the path with somebody, they absolutely know.
Yeah.
And I mean, I can think of examples. Portland, one example, when you said Portland, that I thought about was we had open campus in terms of you could leave for lunch, and an employee was leaving for lunch, coming back, then clocking out for lunch, taking the full half an hour. And that just took a conversation. And one chance, that's all it took, because there was a relationship already there. And making them understand the consequences of what it appeared, as in stealing from the company. And so depending on your organization, the culture, that could have gone a lot of different ways. And we chose to give that employee one chance. And that ended up working out. And maybe if that employee didn't have a lot of time with us, we might have chose not to give a chance. But again, those rules were very clear up front. And usually when it's unauthorized and an employee is doing this intentionally, there's motivation. Motivation might be they're disgruntled about something else at work, the relationship with the manager. There's something they feel they've been unfairly treated, and this is the way I'm going to take care of it. Or there's something going on at home. I need a few extra dollars. I'm struggling to make ends meet, and this is the only way I need a few extra dollars. And again, that's why those relationships and those conversations are so critical.
Coming from that operations side of things and talking with HR, what do you say for HR and how they can better collaborate with operations and management teams to kind of smooth out that communication process when it comes to scheduling adjustments? Like, where can HR lend their hand here a little bit better?
Yeah. One is be a tool provider. So if you know the technology, your payroll, time and attendance tracking systems better than anybody else, what are those tools you can provide to the frontline leaders, operations, informing them, hey, do you know our time clocks could set up a hard stop and start time? We could do 7 minutes. Oh, we have app technology, that type of thing. So be a provider of tools. Secondly, providing fundamental kind of like role playing, if you will, because some of these conversations aren't easy when I as a frontline leader, maybe new in my job, and I've got to go approach somebody about, I think they've worked overtime that wasn't authorized. And how am I going to approach that? And the employee knows the severity of the situation and not just sweep it under the rug. So I think doing that in advance where frontline leaders feel comfortable having that conversation, or also letting them know, hey, if you're not comfortable, like, I'll partner up with you on this. Like, let's do this together. And I think thirdly, why it's so important that this is a joint KPI, not be with HR and operations or HR and sales, whoever you're working with, that it's not just HR's, because then it feels like HR's the police on this thing.
Were there any experiences that you've had with an HR manager that was specifically successful, where they had, your back kind of through and through? They came at the employee with tools. They were somebody that they can lean on, that you can lean on. Was there any examples with any companies that you've worked with or even consulted with?
Well, it was, yes, there was one on the 7 minute in and out. That's one example. I was like, what? We can do that? Like, oh my gosh. Because we were having this situation where employees were clocking in 15 minutes early to the start of their shift to put on, safety shoes, smocks, all that stuff. And we knew it didn't take 15 minutes, but like, how are we, we felt like we're communicating this, and especially today, it's like new employees come through. This was a site that had many temporary workers. Like, how were you managing that? And it's like, we got to do that in combination with technology. So just, again, this HR team member just helped to provide the tools. And that same person also helped with the reporting. So in this weekly meeting, they provided the information of the individuals, by department, etc., and just made it really, really easy for us.
Thank you so much for watching that segment on our webinar on how to stop unauthorized overtime hours for shift-based businesses. If you want to check out more videos, feel free to click on this video here. If you want to look at more videos similar to this type of content, check out our channel. Be sure to subscribe.